Hello and welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series. I'm Professor Sally Gainsbury. I'm from the School of Psychology in the University of Sydney and Brain and Mind Centre, and I'm Director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic. Before I get into today's webinar, which I'm very excited about, I'm very happy to let everyone know that we are doing our season finale as the Early Career Researcher Showcase, which is one of the reasons that the TRG webinar series was founded, to make sure we're focusing on the rising stars in the gambling field. So if you know an early career researcher, which might be an honours or a PhD student or someone who's recently completed their PhD, please check out the TRG website and you can find the instructions for making a submission. We have had quite a lot of interest, so please send through your proposal as soon as possible, and we'll be really pleased to share these excellent rising stars with everyone on the last webinar of the season, which will be the 6th of November. Now I'm very happy to kick off for today. As always, if you're watching live and you have any questions, please pop them in the chat or feel free just to comment amongst yourselves while you're watching. But I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Krista Fisher, who is a researcher from Movember, which is a really important organisation, and in particularly important for us in the gambling field to learn about how to engage young men to think about their health and their mental health. So Krista, you have a really interesting background, and what I'd like to start is by asking you, how do you describe, who you are and what you do when you meet people for the first time?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I'm looking forward to our chat and discussion today. I'm Dr. Krista Fisher. I would firstly kind of describe what I do as I would say I'm in research. I'm a young men's health research fellow at Movember, which gets me a lot of blank looks. And I think that there's a real lack of understanding about what research actually is. Even some of my best friends, I still think, don't really understand what I do day to day. But I would say and describe it as I'm really interested in understanding how we can empower and inspire young men to better look after their health. And really, my role is understanding what their experiences of health and mental health issues are, and then look for ways in which we can work with them to improve and empower them. My background is, I was just going to say, my background is in men's mental health research as well. I recently finished a PhD at the University of Melbourne, which was specifically focused in on young men's anxiety. So, had a background in psychology as well, and had always been super interested in men's mental health specifically.
That's great. So tell me, as a young woman, what drew you to focus on men's mental health, or young men in particular?
I always get asked that question, actually, like why men and why young men? And I think the first time I actually heard some people in this area speak, who then went on to be my supervisors, Dr. Zach Seidler and Professor Simon Rice. I went with a friend to a public seminar which was talking about men's mental health for Movember. And this was 5 years ago now, before I started my PhD. And really, it just inspired me to think about men's mental health challenges in quite a different way, and really, I guess, step outside my own lived experience and perspective as a young woman. There, I guess, were many ways that I started to think about how my own lived experience and my upbringing as a woman could be different to my brother, for example. We're 2 years apart, yet the ways in which my parents, my other family members, broader friends and family, school, other institutions and structural and social kind of relations started to interact with us differently, and how that then influences our own mental health experiences, but also how other people are responding to us. So I think it was just a real curiosity, firstly, but it also, I think, when I was learning more about what we know potentially about differences in young men and young women's mental health experiences, it helped me relate to men in my life differently. And for me, that was a huge impact of the work that we do.
Yeah, and I think it's so important. We've learned a lot about tailoring and the importance of, not just having a universal strategy that you have to account for everyone's backgrounds and cultural backgrounds and age and gender. So it's really great that you kind of focus. I think it is more important to focus on, young men versus just men in general, but a lot of things also focus on young people. What have you learned about the differences between whether it's young men and old men or young men versus young women? Are there some commonalities, and what are the key differences around this young men group? Because we do know when it comes to risky behavior, young men is kind of that's the big focus there. Well, it should be at the least. That seems to be that this is a group of people who are risk-taking and they're impulsive. And we know that neurologically and developmentally, they're not fully developed. And until you get to at least 21, your cognitive functions aren't fully developed as a young man. But, what are some of the other differences that you think are most relevant for addressing mental health in particular amongst this group?
Yeah. And I think like how I like to think about it or describe it is young youth or that adolescent period is such a melting pot of certain kind of key factors going on. You've got, as you mentioned, like neurological and biological changes. There are like literal structural growth and different kind of neurological pathways and structures forming. But it's also kind of a key period where identity formation is such a significant kind of pillar of that period. Your social relationships are so important. I reflect on that time in my life in high school where your friends and what other people thought of you really shaped the way that you thought of yourself. And you're trying to find like not only your own identity, but kind of more broadly what you want to do with your life, who you want to be. So it's just such a kind of changing and like kind of complex time where so many different factors are influencing your own identity, and then also by virtue your mental health. And from young men's perspective specifically, I think it's really a key kind of time in which the social structure of gender really starts to kind of play and influence and shape some of those behaviors which you mentioned around like risk-taking, impulsivity, anger and aggression as well. So when we're talking about gender norms and roles, what we mean is the way that society typically kind of socializes men and women to adopt roles and norms associated with their gender. So for men, it's kind of in Western cultures, typically, we've really, traditional norms of masculinity are still certainly reified and upheld as those kind of key pillars and markers that men should be striving towards and to obtain and embody. So strength, stoicism, emotional restriction, risk-taking as well, independence and self-reliance, so not relying on anyone else or showing or displaying their emotions. So the pressures of a masculinity and those masculine standards that they should be striving for are certainly kind of hyper evident in that adolescent period as well.
Yeah, and it's the question I have is what happens and where is kind of the cutoff? Because with gambling, for example, we know that young men are at the most risk of any age cohort to engaging in problematic gambling. And a lot of the time, the harms aren't necessarily realized. So they might be working full time, but not saving any money. They might be experiencing stress and worry, but downplaying it. So it's, some of these harms are accruing and having an impact, but they're not necessarily sort of realized by the individual. And what we see, though, is that it's not then a clear continuation that, that it evens out in terms of problem gambling split amongst genders. So what happens as young men become, I don't know, not exactly middle-aged young men, but is this just something that people just grow up, their neural circuits develop, they settle down? What kind of happens throughout that period of I don't know how you describe it, sort of young manhood. What happens there over time?
Yeah, it's so interesting with the gambling rates as well, isn't it? I knew that the split in problematic gambling was a lot higher in young men relative to young women, but I didn't kind of know that gap almost starts to reduce over the lifespan. So that's really interesting. And from an addictive disorders perspective, alcohol use and problematic gambling is certainly a lot higher in young men. And there are a number of, I guess, key risk factors that we know contribute to that. But from gambling in particular, I think that the real role of normalization here is incredibly significant and prominent. So those gambling behaviors as a way of socializing with mates and it being kind of a social and leisure activity almost certainly does contribute to that proliferation at the rates in which we're seeing problematic gambling disorders in our young men. But I think also the entryways to gambling behaviors like gaming, the gamification and the I guess access to gambling through social media and smartphone devices. I think that is certainly playing a role as well.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you what you've seen changed even over the last, 5 years, but has there been a change from, I guess you're a researcher, so you're probably familiarizing yourself with research done 10, 20 years ago, and then as research is emerging now and technology in particular, I suspect is the biggest change. You've already mentioned social media and gaming. Have you seen a change in young men's mental health? Are there different theoretical models or have the rates changed, or is it just kind of what people are doing?
Yeah, I mean, in mental health specifically, we've seen the rates of mental health issues continue to increase over the last kind of decade, which, is certainly kind of cause for concern. And I guess why more and more conversation is taking place around young men's and young people's mental health, which is certainly important. I think that there was a lot of speculation, particularly around the key period of COVID and how much kind of changed in our lifestyle and society, that those rates would continue to increase and uh, yeah, kind of intensify things like self-harm, suicide attempts and suicide fatalities and things. And I think even now, almost 2 years kind of later, we're still seeing the effects of like such a big kind of cultural moment and world like impacting and impeding moment really, and the lifestyle stresses that young people are facing, climate change, the cost of living crisis, housing crisis. There are so many things I think that young people are really worried about and that we can see are starting to impact mental health issues and the rates of mental disorders. But I think there's also a really big and kind of, in some ways, positive change that's taking place here in our young people, where they are more likely to seek help. We're seeing higher rates of help seeking than ever before. So the more that we are starting to have conversations around mental health issues, hopefully improve mental health literacy from a really young age, I think that that's contributing to more and more young people then starting to recognize changes and symptoms in and of themselves, and then ultimately kind of putting their hand up and realizing that they do need that extra support. But gambling, I think, is still a mental health issue, really, that's still very misunderstood, and that there's still a real lack of literacy around. Not sure what your thoughts are on that, Sally, but I think our research and work has showed us that the normalization, particularly in young men, of gambling behaviors has led to kind of a real lack of literacy around the actual harms that gambling can be attributed to and cause.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So we have seen as a clinic more young people seek help for sports betting. And that's obviously attributed to the rise of sports betting, because 20 years ago, sports betting wasn't even a question they asked about in prevalent studies. You know, it was essentially a 0% prevalence rate. But now with online gambling and advertising and the increased interest, it's been a way to drive interest. So we are seeing young people engaging in this activity, and then young people seeking help, which is interesting because presumably young men were gambling problematically on races or on pokies or in other forms, but they just didn't seek help. So it is interesting that you're saying that, because that fits clinically with what we are seeing. It's certainly not beating down our doors, but it's increased from almost unheard of for young people to come in. So there is an increased acceptance, and gambling is a really interesting one because we know that it's so highly comorbid, that someone with a gambling disorder has 96% of people with gambling disorders have at least one other lifetime comorbid mental health disorder. So, and it often is that, they precede gambling. So someone might have anxiety or depression or alcohol or substance use, ADHD, personality disorders. All of these things can lead someone to be more likely to have a gambling problem. And then obviously once you have a gambling problem, it can obviously increase the likelihood that you can develop these other, particularly mood disorders and substance use disorders and coping issues. So it's all kind of wrapped around what is, I guess, the presenting issue and what's recognized, because a lot of the time young people don't recognize the harms. And I started to sort of say it, that particularly for young people, it's not that typical portrayal of what a problem gambler would be. They don't have kids to be abandoning, that, they don't have a mortgage potentially to be defaulting on. A lot of the time it's what we would call going without, which is a really tricky thing to say, because everything has an opportunity cost. Like if you go to the movies, you've got less money to put into your savings account. So it's proportional. But if you're working full time, or, and you're not saving any money, then you can't afford the mortgage, down the road. If you're not able to go on holidays with your mates, again, like that's not a be all and end all, but you are missing out. And particularly when you're not developing, you're not dating or forming friendships or building interests or gaining experience in the workplace. At that young age when you're really critical to set yourself up, it's perfectly acceptable to live in kind of cheaper accommodation when you're in your 20s, but then when you're in your 40s and you still can't afford anything, that's when those harms start to be, have accrued but not necessarily realized. So do you see this with other health and mental health issues in young people? I'm wondering what are some of the stumbling blocks that you see amongst young men, or what are the changes that have made it more likely that people are seeking help in this group?
I think that's a really, really interesting point as well, around like the often comorbid nature of things like gambling and alcohol use disorders, is that particularly for young men, gambling and alcohol and drug taking can be both a coping mechanism for internal kind of mental health distress, to help navigate those challenges, ease that distress and that pain, but also to kind of make socializing with mates and other people easier. But it can also perpetuate the challenges, and we know that it does perpetuate the challenges and externalized issues that they then are experiencing, like suicide. I think a suicide in men with problematic gambling is something like 6 to 9 times higher. So, there are really, really significant comorbid challenges, I think, that young men are often navigating here. And in terms of the times in which it's presenting, unfortunately, so often young men aren't really coming into contact with health services until that crisis point, until things, as you said, Sally, get so bad, or they feel so kind of behind the mark at which their maybe friends might be, or the place in their life, the successes that they thought that they would achieve by a certain time. Often then it's like, okay, now I'm coming to seek help, and starting to unravel the sometimes decade-long problematic mental health issues that they've had up to this point. So unfortunately, I think still it often does take like a crisis point or a tipping point in which someone then starts to introspectively and retrospectively see the kind of tipping points that have then led them to this point in which they're now experiencing a culmination of issues and challenges. And I think just one other point to note there is that gambling and alcohol challenges, because they're so normalized in that in our young especially Australian male culture, it can often be overlooked. The kind of problematic nature of it, the dependence in which someone is partaking and engaging in these behaviours, often that isn't, the harms of that aren't really realised until a certain point where it does just become so all-consuming. There's no savings, or it's starting to impact into interpersonal relationships, family, friend relationships, and then the kind of weight of the issue is then realised.
And I wonder, that makes me think of risk and protective factors, because obviously even within young men there are different groups. So have you found with mental health in young men or physical health, are there certain protective factors? We know for gambling, if someone engages with gambling in a family context, or if they have family modeling, or if it's a strong part of their peer group, that's definitely a risk factor. Are there other protective factors like having strong family and friend bonds, or is it something that you feel better educated or from a different, a different socioeconomic class? Are there risk and protective factors you see amongst young men in terms of mental health and physical health?
Absolutely, yeah. I think friends is such a interesting and important protective factor, because it can also be a risk factor. But when there are those strong, positive social connections, when a young man is feeling like they're valued and that they have those kind of strong mateship bonds with friends, we know that can be really protective, both in a way of potentially noticing earlier indicators of mental health challenges, but also in terms of inspiring vulnerability and creating that safe space to be able to open up and have those conversations. Family and also male role models is a big one. So even if there aren't those role models in the immediate family environment, teachers, coaches, brothers, older friends can play a really, really significant role there. Also, just the kind of I was going to say mundane, just because they're so kind of talked about and can sometimes, I think, be overlooked. But exercise, like a kind of healthy outlet for kind of that emotional dysregulation as well can be really important, and healthy diet and all of those things. We know continually that they are shown to protect against health and mental health challenges.
Yeah, and I think it's something about being a contrary activity as well. So as opposed to telling people, gamble in moderation, but if you're telling them, live a healthy lifestyle, exercise, well, if you're out late gaming or gambling or drinking, you can't get up and go for a run in the morning. You're less likely to eat the healthy food. So it is all sort of part of a contrary lifestyle. And that's one thing we know for gambling, that if it's a balanced activity, so if it's something that, as long as they're engaged in, a broader variety of activities in their lives, relationships, physical hobbies, that it's when gambling starts to sort of take over all those other ones, that's when it starts to shift for problematic behavior and lead to more mental health consequences.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And because it is I think as you touched on there, it's a spectrum of harms, right? So the protective factors, there are going to be different the effectiveness of those protective factors and coping strategies and coping mechanisms to deal with mental health challenges and gambling at different points along that spectrum. So in terms of, I guess, early intervention and protection, the harm minimization is certainly like a really important point. But then at the point in which I guess the threshold from low harm to significant harm is exceeded, then we often are needing to, I guess, get that external support to be able to open up to other people about the issues that are going on, and I guess the effectiveness of therapy and things like that.
Yeah, which makes me then think, what do we do? So, neurologically and biologically, adolescence is a time when people deliberately push back against their family members and they seek, independence and peer groups and almost to rebel. So this is a group that is very difficult to communicate with because they are almost biologically wired to resist any instructions or suggestions that they should do something. And we know that campaigns of don't have sex and don't do drugs and all of these sorts of things that it's not the right way to communicate with anyone really, but particularly with these groups. So what do we do as researchers, in public health or in other fields? How do we communicate with young men? Have you got any strategies for us?
I would somewhat push back on the notion that I think sometimes we do look at young men as a really difficult to engage population, that, they're totally resistant to mental health messaging and health campaigns and things. But I think we only need to look at influences, problematic influences, don't get me wrong, but the Andrew Tates, the Joe Rogans, I'm lumping a lot of kind of people as problematic in that basket. But what I mean is that there are a number of people who are engaging young men really well and really effectively, but not necessarily with the narrative and messaging that we know is kind of promoting healthy behaviours and healthy gender ideologies and things like that. So I think that we actually need to take and learn a lot from the people that are already talking to young men and reaching young men. And I think that you're right about the don't have sex and don't drink and all of that. That is just not going to work. And we need to look at organizations, for example, Movember, and a number of other organizations that do this really well, where we actually look at ways that we can talk to men, not down to men and young men in particular, and young people. I think it's about not dismissing the challenges and issues and experiences that they're facing and navigating, and assuming that we have the solutions and the answers and the kind of foresight to know exactly what they're experiencing and what they need. I think if it matters to them, it should matter to us. And that's really the way in which we're able to kind of create and reach these young men and make those inroads, I think.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense from our experience. We're doing a lot with what we call co-design. So we're speaking to the group we're trying to influence. When we're trying to influence regular gambling consumers, we're speaking to them and consulting with them at every single stage of our, communications and research. So is that something you think is helpful? How do you come up with strategies or campaigns to reach kind of a bigger group? Do you go for a big group? Do you go for small targeted things? What's some of the things that you think are useful to reach this group?
Yeah, I think co-design is obviously a really important kind of pillar of, I think, the research field that's certainly started to change and gain momentum even since I have been in this field. I've noticed more and more a push to actually speak to and engage the very population that you're wanting to serve, which makes so much sense, doesn't it? And I think that from a clinical perspective, I imagine that for you guys and yourselves, you'd have a number of people who have maybe gone through therapy and then started to reflect on their own experience, and then through those stories are able to relate in such a different way with young men, for example, than we would as researchers who sometimes maybe don't approach this space with sharing our own stories or experiences. A number of people in this field, I'm sure, would have their own lived experience of mental health challenges or gambling issues. But that's not necessarily the hat that we're always wearing from a professional standpoint. And that's, I think, the wonderful thing about co-design is that it allows that storytelling. So it's almost beneficial for the people who are involved in it to share their own stories, to share their own experiences, to feel like they're able to kind of gain a sense of purpose and yeah, and almost using, I guess, their kind of hardships and challenges for good. But I think that you can do that in a number of ways. Typically, with research, what we've tried to do is we've gone to young people, young men specifically, with, I guess, a plan for what we're wanting to do with a specific research project. So we might have an area that we want to look at, and we seek to get their feedback and input. But I think it's also really important to do that at multiple stages along a research project. So when we have results, we tend to go in and speak to them at that time as well. Like, I've had a number of instances where I've kind of thought something and had some key takeaways or high level insights in my mind, and I go and speak to young men about something, and they'll frame it in such a different way that I'm like, oh, of course, like, that makes a lot of sense. And when we're talking about implications and what the research results might mean from a practical or health promotion standpoint, to hear from them what we really need to focus on and where avenues for change are, I find so inspiring and invigorating. I love that kind of aspect of research work.
Yeah, and that's really useful, I think, to take the research and really understand it. And what's the implementation or what's the mechanism of action? Is it education? Is it changing attitudes? Is it social peers? I'm kind of drawing on to the theory of reasoned action, some of these frameworks. What is it that we need to shift? Is it an educational campaign, or is it an attitude shift, or is it making it easier for people, perceived behavioral control? What do you think are the key points to hit? And then I'm going to ask you about the implementation, how we actually do it.
How we actually do that. Gosh, there's so many, like what we tend to, I guess, always think about is like a multi-pronged approach. So I think all of those things that you've said, not to skirt out of an answer, but all of that applies for young men's mental health. If we're thinking about like gambling harms specifically, potentially, I think what we have been talking about, and I guess having more and more conversations about, is how we speak to the young men themselves through something like, for example, an education campaign where we're using stories of young men shared by young men to other young men about their own, for example, gambling or mental health challenges, their own experiences, how it got to that point, and then what they found works for them. We know that young men are going to resonate a lot more with that messaging rather than broad kind of brushstroke public health campaigns that they aren't going to feel like resonates with their own experiences that they're going through. But I think also on the flip side or other end of the spectrum, particularly with something like gambling harms, we need to do a lot of work behind the scenes to also push for stronger regulation and to hold these industries and companies who are profiting billions and billions of dollars off young men. We also need to be kind of cultivating and trying to encourage collective partnerships and pressure to regulate these industries and really, not place the burden at the feet of young men themselves. Like there needs to be a greater kind of accountability from a regulation standpoint on, the commercial kind of aspects of this industry, I think.
Oh, and that's a really important point to highlight, definitely, that yes, we can get, influencers and we can educate, and there is a role for young people to be, or for everyone to take responsibility for their behavior. But absolutely, how do we have a multi-pronged successful public health campaign when we're competing against advertising and marketing for billions and billions of dollars? Is this something you've, seen any successes from, or any insights into how to make some influences?
Yeah. Oof, that is a good question. I think, and I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this as well. There's a initiative called Love the Game that I think do this really well, is that they are trying to inspire, and they have inspired collective partnership around sporting organisations and clubs and things to put pressure on, or call for greater and stronger regulation. Around sports betting and things. And I think that a point that you touched on around influencers, using like athletes as well to be able to kind of call out both industry and regulations around betting, specifically sports betting, but also start to shift some of the cultural and social norms that do normalize gambling as something that is part of like Australian culture, that we are so kind of quick to engage in it as a like a leisure activity when watching sporting games and all of those kinds of things. I think I'm yet to see it done well, from a social media and technology perspective. And I think that that is a gap that we'll certainly be seeing more of a call to action in. So as we kind of touched on at the very start of our chat today, the landscape in which gambling and also mental health harms are taking place has changed so much. So we're seeing more and more kind of gambling access, but also gambling behaviors on social media, through phone apps and all of those kinds of things. And I think that there needs to be much greater kind of calls for better regulation in this space. And that can really be a global initiative as well. Like, given that social media companies are, domiciled and in different countries, there can be like collective and global calls for action as well.
Yeah, I think there's so much there. So I love the game, a Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation initiative. And there's also Reclaim the Game, which is a New South Wales gambler initiative. So both trying to encourage sporting teams to forego gambling sponsorship and to focus on the game and get away from that sort of entwined nature of betting with sports betting, so that when young people are watching sports, which is again a healthy and an appropriate activity, they're not constantly being bombarded with the gambling ads, which are targeting that very population, and preying on these ideas of sort of social, relationships with friends, and making it a part of your social friendship group circle, which is betting, or at least doing it in a balanced way. It shouldn't be just a required part of betting. It's definitely an adjunct. So these are some really interesting examples, and trying to get along that sort of trend of that influences that you were talking about, of making it relevant, making it something that's for people and that they can relate to, and it's a target audience, I think is really, really interesting. And building on how to sort of oppose that advertising, but also drawing in what is relevant for young people. And then that platform, I think, is so important. Are we talking about side of bus campaigns, or are we, I think, a lot more around social media or influencers, like you say? It's one thing just to put an ad on Facebook, but I've got actually a group of students who I'm working with, and because they're undergrad students, I sort of turn them loose without telling them what to do, because I'm not an undergraduate student. So they've come up with making a TikTok video. They're making these interactive posters. They've actually built a game, like gamified this idea of kind of weaving education in, which is what some other groups have done as well, putting it into a game. And like, are these, do you think, these sort of digital tools? Another thing we're working on is having a digital tool that helps people track their spend. So we're trying to avoid, I think, any conversation around help or problems or harm, which isn't seen as relevant to young people. Do you see, is there particular language or strategies that young people are more likely to engage in?
And those examples that you kind of spoke about, that like exemplifies perfectly why it's so important, like co-design processes, to actually speak to the young people, the young men that we're hoping to serve. Because the ideas like TikTok videos, or that an advert should would likely be more kind of engaging and have wider reach on TikTok versus Facebook, when we know that more young people are on TikTok, for example. That, you know, it should be a very basic premise, but I still think that a lot of initiatives, organizations, and campaigns, for example, could be doing that a lot better. I think things that we know that relate and engage young men really well is humor. Like being at that level, that kind of kind of colloquial language, the mateship language, talking as a mate to a mate, kind of, I think is really important from a language perspective. The media and modes in which we deliver these campaigns and initiatives should be already in spaces that young men are going to. So whilst there are calls for, you know, greater regulation around advertisements in sporting games, sporting events, bars, all of those settings, which make a lot of sense and really, I think, should be almost the first thing that we're actually turning our attention to at the moment. It's crazy just how rife advertisements still are. But there are also settings in which early intervention and prevention strategies can also be delivered too. So I think it's like looking at not necessarily reinventing the wheel here, but like, where are young men? Where can we reach them? And how do we reach them in a way that we know is going to resonate and engage them?
Do you think there's a way to actually get some of the influencers involved potentially, who, I guess it's a balance? And what do you think is the role of working with the gambling industry or people who are already influencers in this space? Do you think there's a responsibility or any way, or is it just too difficult to get, a group that's trying to push gambling to at the same time try and push it in a responsible way?
Yeah, that is tricky, isn't it? It's like, at what point would you dance with the devil, for example, so yeah, so many ways. I think, like, in terms of working with influencers, AFL, I'm thinking of like AFL players, and there are potentially like NRL players who have come out and spoken about gambling harms or put more pressure on, if I'm thinking about AFL players, for example, put more pressure on the AFL to remove gamble advertisements in sporting matches and things. I think that the messaging is going to be a lot more impactful when it's coming from the athletes themselves, because young men, for example, look up to these athletes so much. You could have a doctor or the, leading expert in gambling harms talking about the need for better regulation or minimization of gambling advertisements, and then you could have a player coming out and say the same thing, and the young people are going to resonate a lot more with the player or an influencer, someone who is trusted, who already has that kind of influence over them in their lives, who they aspire to be. I think we also need to think about the fact that because gambling is so entrenched in our Australian culture, it's going to also require a cultural shift around the kind of normalized behaviors and aspirations in terms of, social settings and all of those kinds of things. But I do think it's an interesting thing to think about. Like, I've seen that play out in more market specific contexts. But again, just going back to, I guess, the social media landscape, I haven't necessarily seen influencers who in that space specifically, not like athletes or in sporting contexts, actually talk about or be kind of the spokesperson of certain gambling or alcohol initiatives. And I think that could be a really interesting thing that may be required in the future or should be looked at in the future.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space. I think we had Chris Rain on the first season of this, who's created the Hello Sunday Morning, alcohol sober curious, he described it, sort of lifestyle movement, which has been really influential. And there have been a couple of surveys showing that, for example, most AFL fans want to have less advertising in the game and want to have less association with gambling. So I wonder if there is really a role for, a one or a group or whoever wants, take the lead in young men or young people actually leading a movement. Because there are a few people on TikTok and Twitter and a few places trying to have this conversation, but they're almost lost in there's so many accounts doing the opposite, promoting gambling. So when you're searching for something, it would be very hard to find the counter movement. But we've seen this in climate change. Young people have been incredibly active in promoting social change and cultural change. So I think that's an interesting angle to try and push for the young people who aren't comfortable with what's happening in society to take a leadership role, and facilitating young people. Organizations like ours could facilitate young people in doing that as opposed to trying to do it ourselves. I think that's a really interesting approach.
Yeah, totally. And, another idea that just came to mind as well is like, again, from the more commercial regulation aspect, we should also potentially because I hate to think that the onus would just be on young people to have to inspire or instigate this movement in and of themselves. There's also potentially a big role for us as kind of experts in this space to put more pressure on, again, in a social media context, regulators to be better regulating gambling advertisements, gambling and punting influencers that are gaining more and more kind of traction and momentum in online spaces. Like even just putting more pressure on advancements in the way that we're actually trying to moderate, regulate, and reduce this kind of content in online settings, I think would also be really important and impactful. Yeah.
And do you have any examples of ways in which this sort of social shift can be encouraged?
Examples in the way of like programs that have done that well, or
Any way you've seen an organization help facilitate young people taking a movement in their own social change?
yeah. I think like the climate change example that you spoke to before is like uh kind of a perfect example and an instance of that. I think young people are been shown to kind of engage with and care more about social issues than potentially past generations as well. They're so kind of inspired to take action, and empowering that discontent and want for better, I think is a really important thing to do. And they can do it in different ways, see different avenues of trying to inspire and engage a movement, like on social media, for example, than we would.
Yeah, and do you think there's a role for organizations? Movember obviously is focused on young men and mental health and physical health. There's organizations that focus specifically on depression or specifically on anxiety or specifically on substances. Do you think there's a role for organizations to work together to achieve some changes?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, like as we've spoken about with gambling and mental health issues, the comorbid nature of these challenges that young men are facing speaks to the need for kind of collaborative and collective effort here, and leveraging off each other's expertise and the work that each other are doing to almost bring the two sectors together sometimes, rather than siloed apart. I think a really great example of this at the moment, and a very topical example, is gender-based violence and gambling and alcohol industries, and the need, I think, for more kind of collaboration across these sectors rather than disaggregation.
Yeah, definitely. Particularly with gambling, we know is so interrelated. Intimate partner violence and gambling are unfortunately incredibly correlated, and obviously drinking and substance use. So there's a real need for organizations, which is one of the reasons we're actually doing some research looking at psychological comorbidities in relation to gambling, and seeing what impact that has on treatment outcomes and treatment seeking. Look, as we're coming towards the end of our conversation, which as always, I knew would fly by, Krista, I want to turn it over to you. You know, you've got an international audience of people interested in technology and risk. Do you have any asks, anything you want to plug that you're doing?
Yeah. God, what a great opportunity to kind of have the platform here a little bit. So a lot of work that we're starting to focus in on at the moment is really exploring young men's social media use and how like problematic content in social media spaces can influence and play a role in poorer mental health outcomes for young men. So a term that has been, I guess, gaining momentum and seems like is becoming more and more talked about at the moment is the manosphere. So it's kind of a collection of groups or echo chambers, sometimes it's called, that are speaking to kind of restrictive masculine norms and unfortunately advocating for some harmful health and gender ideological underpinnings. So we're particularly focused in on that, wanting to understand how different types of this content is leading to health harms for young men. So that's a big focus of ours. I'll also kind of be more broadly involved in and wanting to talk a little bit about some of the broader work that Movember's doing. So where one area that we're looking into is social media, but also wanting to focus in on how we can encourage and inspire health promotion in gaming and esports settings, as well as traditional community sports settings. So really the kind of big focus for us is reaching young men where they're at and understanding how we can better inspire and empower them to look after their own mental health.
Oh, well, it's such a terrific initiative, and I don't think anyone can fault the work that you're doing. It's fantastic to have such a impassioned person and organisation involved. Thank you so much, Krista, for your generous time and sharing your expertise in this area. It's great that, you know, you've really championed this cause and have such expertise in driving change. There's so much to do, but I think it's amazing the work that you're doing.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Thanks so much, Sally, and for the chat today. And you too, you guys doing a lot of great work. So it's wonderful to be able to have this shared conversation today.
Well, thanks so much, Krista. And thank you for everyone who's watching. Thank you very much for our behind the scenes support, TJ Santos and Harrison Stein and the Brain and Mind Centre who sponsored this webinar series. As I mentioned at the start, if you know an early career researcher, please send them to the Technology Risk and Gambling website to see the details of how you can submit a proposal for our showcase. And next week, we are actually speaking to Gohar Yazbadi, who is speaking from the organisation of older people, talking about loneliness and mental health amongst older adults. So going from one end of the spectrum to the other. So I think that's really important to look at, you know, these unique groups and the risks that different people have and where the commonalities are as well. So please tune in for that. Krista, thank you again. If anyone wants to reach you, is LinkedIn potentially the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, LinkedIn, also on Twitter as well, Krista S. Fisher. But yeah, LinkedIn or email as well, krista.fisher@movember.com. So yeah, more than welcome to email and reach out.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Krista, and thank you everyone for tuning in today.